And some grounding. So structural and racism results in a disproportionate number of non-white people experiencing homelessness. There are no quick fixes to this issue that we're about to explore. This work is necessary, it is uncomfortable and ongoing, but worth it. This this is not just a check in the box exercise, not to say we just did a grounding or we did a training about racial equity, but it is the beginning of continuation of our journey in service to people experiencing homelessness in Oregon. Next slide. So our engagement expectations. So during this engagement, we expect each attendee to be present and listen actively, maintain mutual respect for differing viewpoints, not seek a one-size-fit-all approach, challenge the way we have historically responded to homelessness, and see yourself as part of the solution. And think about prioritizing attendance in future sessions and participate. We don't have any chats to poll today, but definitely any feedback or feelings and emotions, definitely put it into the chat. Next slide. So why are we here? We aren't focused on individual behavior in this session. We're focused on systems and institutions and how racism has been embedded in those historically and presently. We will look at the disparities that exist in the various systems, lots of numbers and percents, touch briefly on why the disparities exist, and look at how those disparities impact the homeless service system at a disproportionate rate. We will only have time to really touch on the why, given our short time together, and we want to spend time coming up with the why and the thinking through the whys and what have been in your communities. Next slide.
Okay. So before I get started on the content, I want to just add a tiny bit of framing that I should have done during my introduction. So I just want to acknowledge and call out that I am a cisgender white male, and I'm here to talk about racial equity. And I try to always remain aware of the complexity around that. And my real goal in these conversations is to make sure that I am using my voice as it comes from an inherent place of privilege to elevate things that need to be elevated with that platform, and then keep it out of the way when it's not needed. So I just want to point that out, call out that awareness, and acknowledge the complexities around that. I will now jump right into the content. So generally in any equity work, we lead with racial equity explicitly, but not exclusively, and I want to be clear about why that is. So across all the identities listed on the slide that you see here, there are inequities based on race. Racial inequities persist in every system across the country without exception. With equity, we're seeking to create better outcomes for all. Equity is a condition that would be achieved if a part of one's identity no longer predicted how one fares, at least in the statistical sense. And then I also want to add a special note here on rural equity. So on rural equity, addressing inequities is difficult everywhere. It's always a hard conversation. It's always a hard process. Difficulties in rural areas are often more acute because there's lower data quality, there's resource scarcity, geographical distance, and many other reasons. So when we look at all the things on the screen there, just want to point out that geographic equity, it's a real thing, especially when we think about rural areas. Next slide, please.
Mike, we
Yes.
have a hand raised up from Marisa.
Absolutely.
You probably can't see it right now.
Yeah.
Marisa?
Yeah, thank you, Mary Frances. So I'm sorry, this actually kind of goes back to what Kenisha was going over, and I probably should have mentioned this before. I don't know why, but Teams never shows me the chat. So if there's a conversation happening, I tried to work on that today with my administrator. Unfortunately, we can sort it out. But I guess it would just be nice if folks want to kind of bring up the conversation for those of us who can't see the chat. Is that possible? Because it kind of sounds like we're not going to have a lot of back and forth with task force members and facilitators today. Am I understanding correctly? We're not going to really be talking amongst ourselves today.
Right. This is more of a presentation to present to everyone.
Okay. Yeah. So Yeah, that would be really nice if folks want to just mention what's happening conversation-wise, if it's not too much trouble.
Absolutely. And I'll
Yep.
be sure to kind of transcribe anything that's happening in the chat. And I'm sorry about that, Marisa. You didn't miss anything. Rowan just said that they're here to take notes for Vanessa. And I said we were going to pause for your comment or question.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay.
Sounds good. All right. Next slide, please. So the image you see on this slide is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and it's from their campaign to promote health equity. The word equity is used widely, but understanding of the term is lacking in a lot of ways. In the foundation's report regarding the consensus of the meaning of the word equity, it was defined as everyone has a fair and just opportunity, removing all obstacles such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education, and housing, safe environments, and healthcare. So, just when we talk about equity, what we really want to point out here is what you see on the image there. So on the top, you've got the concept of equality. Everyone has a bicycle. On the bottom, you've got the concept of equity. Everyone has the right bicycle for them. Next slide, please.
And as we transition to the next slide, we want to show a video. And some people in the room may have seen this video, but it's worth watching again. This video is called A Conversation with Native Americans on Race. And Mary Frances want to transition us to it, if you can just bear with us.
I'm Apache, but really that's the government's name because they can't say Zithlikai and De.
They will tell me how awesome they think it is that I've decided to be a part of my culture. And it's funny to me, it like hits me really weird and I don't like it. And I didn't know why at first, but it's because I haven't decided to be a part of my culture. I live it every day.
I'm more comfortable with the term Native, divorced from Native American. I know there are people who use Indigenous, and if there is one term I do not like to be called is American Indian.
And for me, to be Indigenous is to have an intimate and interconnected relationship to a homeland.
And so that's really important because land is, tied to every aspect of who we are.
Being Native in a city is almost a daily reminder of your people's erasure, of the fact that people don't even remember that you're here and that you exist.
But what I did encounter was just this preconceived notion that all Native Americans are dead.
I've had older white men come up to me and say, oh man, if this was 40 years ago, I can just do whatever I wanted to.
The cattle outside doing the work and the dog inside the house, those are property. Those are the Black folks in America. They're our property to white men. Then the exotic antelope on the wall, or the exotic, that's the native, that's how natives are perceived in America.
We're treated like animals. They monitor our blood quantum. We're the only, besides dogs and horses, I don't know of any other animal that they monitor the blood quantum.
The way I explain it to people is like, imagine a pizza with different slices and let's say 32 slices. Of the 32 slices, I'm 28 Apache. That's my particular blood quantum. And Native Americans in the US are the only minority group who have to prove their nativeness on an Indian card.
It's used to divide Native people against each other, because it can be used as a way to say, I am more Native than you, and I was a part of that too. I used my 4/4 to kind of make myself feel better against other people.
The one drop rule, meaning that, one drop of Black blood makes you Black, that was to keep as many people oppressed or, legitimize their oppression as possible. But on the other side, one drop of anything else completely dilutes you as a Native person. So if you're a Native person, you have a one drop of something else, and suddenly you're less Native. So it's the opposite.
Traditionally, within the Apache society, you go by the mother. And if the mother's recognized as Apache, she has her clan, the children are unquestionably Apache. Not in the American context, not when patriarchy trumps matriarchy. So what does that mean? My sisters are short 1/16 of a degree. What does that mean? Does that mean their pinkies aren't Apache? What does that mean?
Being a mixed race person is a whole nother side of it, but that's a very common experience in our tribe. So it's not as if we're unusual in that way. What is unusual is the admixture of Black.
My grandfather actually doesn't want people, if he hears that somebody from the tribe is coming over, he won't come out of his room because he doesn't want them to know that he's that complexion. That he doesn't, I guess he doesn't want me to be affiliated with having African American blood, but I mean, I say it. It's not going to change anything.
If it were up to the American government, Natives wouldn't be around, because after a certain time, that blood will dilute. It will go out. And so if there's no Native peoples to provide benefits, then we're not obligated to meet these treaty rights. And if we're not obligated to meet these treaty contracts, then the land is available. The resources are available.
And I think that essential point about our claim to sovereignty, our claim to land, our claim to a culture, our claim to resources is one that gets lost if we don't insist upon the fact that we are nations.
And we have taken huge steps to decolonizing, and that proof comes from people being able to have the opportunities to speak their language, to be on their ancestral land.
But the thing with decolonization is that it's an ongoing process, just like grieving, just like any loss.
As much as possible now, I try to tell people that I have a Native American name, and maybe it doesn't mean anything to you, but it means everything to me. My name maybe doesn't have a romanticized Hollywood Indian name, but my name has more meaning than that. My name means that my family survived. My family survived disease. My family survived Catholicism. My family survived settler colonialism, and my family, they survived. I survived. My existence is resistance. Me saying my name is Skiam Tulks, that is resistance in and of itself.
So I know that is deep video. For the sake of time, we do have to move on, but I want to recognize that that was a deep video.
So a little context around history that we plugged in here. So today, we're going to talk about some historical events and historical topics, which you may or may not be familiar with, or if you are familiar, you might not have thought of them in the context of equity. And the point with this is that's okay. It is okay that you might not have, or even if you don't know these things. The way we view history and historical events is largely shaped by the way we learn about them. And in America, there are a lot of variables that shape how history is taught. One of the most important of those is selection and approval of history textbooks, of all things that you didn't think I might bring up. But in his analysis, James Loewen determined that American history textbooks most often focus on collections of people and dates, and less on broader historical ideas like democracy or white supremacy. This strategy of teaching history, emphasizing the what rather than the why, doesn't really facilitate critical thinking and understanding of history as a dynamic structure of things. So again, many of the topics we will cover, you might not know much about them. You might. If you do, is likely because you went out and made purposeful effort to seek out that knowledge on your own, and it is okay. So we just want to point that out as we go through the things we are going to talk about. Next slide, please.
And as we start talking about organs history, I want to just acknowledge that there's no way we can put all of organs history in this amount of time. So we just want to make sure we state that. In his book, Jeffrey Oster investigates how America depended on Native people dispossession and the federally sanctioned use of force to remove or slaughter indigenous people for U.S. expansion. Oster documents the losses that Native people suffered from relentless violence and upheaval and the effects of disease, deprivation, exposure. And I'm talking about the Surviving Genocides, the book, the picture that you see right there. This book investigates the history of the United States' violent path towards ending a continental empire. It deepens our understanding of the seizures of Native lands, including the use of treaties to create the appearance of Native consent to disposition. Also documents the resilience of Native people, showing how they survived genocide by creating alliances, defending their towns, and rebuilding their communities. So in June 1844, the provisional government passes Oregon's first Black exclusion law. It states that Blacks who tried to settle in Oregon would be publicly whipped, 39 lashes, repeated every 6 months until they left Oregon. On November 9th, 1857, Oregon voters approved the Oregon Constitution, which bans both slavery and new Black residents in Oregon. It makes it illegal for Blacks to own real estate, make contracts, vote, or use the legal system. In 1926, exclusionary clause is removed from the Oregon Constitution. But in 1927, state constitution is amended to removing voter restrictions against African and Asian Americans. In 1884, the Oregon statewide railroad system was completed, connecting all the regions of the state. Oregon remained relatively isolated into this completion of the railroad network. The Central Pacific Chinese immigrant workers received $26 to $35 a month for a 12-hour day, 6-day work week, in a month where, 6-day work week, and had to provide their own food and tents. But while white workers received $35 a month and were furnished with food and shelter, Chinese immigrants workers saved as much as $20 a month, which many eventually used to buy land. They earned a reputation as tireless and extraordinarily reliable workers. 12,000 of the Central Pacific Railroad's 13,500 employees were Chinese immigrants. 1888, in a trial in Enterprise, Oregon, 3 men were acquitted of murder for the massacre of at least 34 Chinese gold miners. The ringleaders fled the area and were never tried. Unknown is how much gold the gang might have plundered, but rumors put the figure from 3,000 to more than 50,000. The trial attracted little attention from the press, and Wallowa County folks swept the sordid saga under the carpet for more than a century. It wasn't until 1995 a county clerk opened an old safe in the Wallowa County courthouse and found a long secreted cache of documents relating to the massacre. In 1923, the Oregon State Legislature, dominated by members of the Klan, passed a number of restrictive laws. The Alien Land Law prevented first-generation Japanese Americans from owning or leasing land. The Oregon Business Restriction Law allowed cities to refuse business licenses to first-generation Japanese Americans. Next slide. So in the 1920s, the KKK flourished in Oregon. By the mid-1920s, its membership was estimated between 14,000 to 20,000, with numerous sympathizers who were not officially members. Oregon's governor from 1922 to 26, Walter M. Pierce, though not a member, was overtly supported by the Klan, and he promoted the Klan's agenda. 1922, together with Friesman's Klansmen superheaded spearheaded, a drive to outlaw private and parochial schools, which they view as primary obstacles in their drive for Americanism. The Klan used an initiative that would require all children between the ages of 8 and 18 to attend public schools. The rallying cry of its sponsors was one flag, one school, one language. Oregons, by a margin of 11,000, voted to make their state the first in the US to mandate a strict uniform school system. In 1924, the federal court in Portland declared this law unconstitutional. In 1925, in Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the US Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional as well. In 1935, Oregon law officially segregated Mexican students based on being of Indian descent. It made clear to exempt white Mexicans, those fair-skinned descendants of the Spaniards who did not have Indian blood. During World War II, Oregon's African-American population grew substantially in Portland, increasing from 2,565 in 1940 to 25,000 in 1944. Over 7,000 non-white workers were employed in the Portland shipyards. Although Kaiser had promised good jobs in the shipyards, local unions resisted integration. Many help wanted notices specified white only. After pressure from the NAACP, the Kaiser brothers, which was a federal inspection team, and a reprimand from President Roosevelt, the unions compromised. More skilled jobs were open to Blacks, but only for the duration of the war. Blacks were allowed to work in union-controlled shops and paid union dues, but were denied union benefits. To accommodate the influx of workers, a new town was built in the lowland areas adjacent to the Columbia River, just north of Portland. First called Kaiserville and then Vanport, it was the world's largest housing project with 35,000 residents, making it the second largest community in Oregon. With this rise in diversity and population came signs throughout Portland. We cater to white trade only. On Memorial Day, the Columbia River flood left 39 people dead and obliterated all of Vanport. It had become a declining settlement as wartime workers were replaced and non-whites were encouraged to leave the area. They were not needed for the war efforts. There was no direct action taken by Portland's housing authority to resettle flood victims as patterns of segregations were reinforced. Most displaced Blacks were forced to congregate in the Albina section of town or left Portland area altogether. There were no places to live and no more well-paying jobs now that the World War II was over. In 1948, Oregon's realtors followed the National Realtors Code based on an earlier state law that proclaimed that a realtor should never introduce into a neighborhood member of any race or nationality whose presence will be detrimental to property values. 1967 through 69, racial tensions escalated into riots in Portland's African-American communities. As we go to the 1970s, there's no current concrete evidence that sundown laws existed on the statute books. That hasn't been found in Oregon, but there is a rich oral history. It describes signs and attitudes throughout Oregon well into the 1970s that warned Blacks and other people of color to be out of town by sundown. James Lowen's book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, documents this practice throughout the United States. In the mid-1970s, Oregon's Indian Education Association was formed. OIEA works to update, and help implement the Oregon American Indian Alaskan Native Education State Plan. OIEA continues to help to formulate state policy to eliminate stereotypical Native American mascots in Oregon public schools and keep Native languages and cultures alive. In 1981, 2 police officers dumped dead possums at the African-American owned restaurant in Portland. The incident evoked ugly KKK imagery and touched off on the most contentious dispute between police, city government, and the public. As a result, a citizen committee to review police actions in Portland was created. 1996, Oregon's Executive Order 96-30 acknowledged the need for better relations between state government and federally recognized Indian tribal governments in the state. The governor created a forum to maximize intergovernmental relations. The forum included an education committee. In 2000, Oregon finally voted. This is in 2000. Finally voted to remove all racist language from its constitution, which still had a clause that read, "No free Negro or mulatto not residing in the state at the time of the adoption of this constitution shall come, reside, or be within the state, or hold any real estate." Though this and other discriminatory language was rendered unenforceable by federal laws and amendments to the U.S. Constitution, it was not until that election, that removal of several examples of institutional racism and oppression was taken out of the Oregon Constitution. In 2005, Native Language Preservation and Instruction Partnership was formed through a collaborative effort between Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes and the Oregon Department of Education to support implementation of endangered American Indian language and cultural instruction programs in Oregon schools. So next slide. We have another video to show you, and this one is a little shorter, but as we transition.
You know, the death of George Floyd has many people here taking a closer look at Oregon's Black history. A Portland woman has dedicated much of her life to studying and teaching about that very topic. Her name is Walida Imarisha, and she's an educator and historian. So today we want to highlight her work as part of our series of community conversations. Walida, thank you so much for talking with me today. You know, let's start with this. When people think about racism, I think a lot of people think of slavery in the South, but let's talk Oregon's history. How far back do you have to go to find that sort of inequality?
Absolutely. I think that's really important, that a lot of myths about race are told in this country. One of them being that racism is something that's located in the South. The reality is racism is an American problem. Malcolm X said anything south of the Canadian border is the South. And so the issues around race and the foundations of white supremacy in Oregon have existed since before Oregon was a state. The foundations of the Oregon Territory were as a racist white utopia. And we can see that by many laws that have been passed, especially the Black Exclusion Law. The first one was passed in 1844. Which outlawed Black people from living in the Oregon Territory, which was the entire Northwest. That law also included the lash law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped up to 39 lashes every 6 months until we left. So from the very foundation of Oregon as a territory, as a state, this has been the product of being a racist white utopia.
We talk about, you know, Portland labeling itself a progressive city, but in fact, it's 70% white. So why do you think that is, and why haven't more Black people moved to this area?
I think, again, it's incredibly important. The foundations of Oregon, the foundations of Portland are as a racist white utopia. And the institutions that shape all of our lives are rooted in that foundation of white supremacy. And we see it enacting in every indicator across the board. So if you look at things like the Urban League of Portland's State of Black Oregon report, you see in every category that there are huge disparities between Black and white experiences on education, on housing, on criminal legal engagements, on environmental justice. This is, again, not by coincidence. This is by design. And Oregon and Portland have not ever committed to doing the real work of uprooting institutional racism, preferring to, give liberal lip service, which does nothing except really gaslight people of color about their experiences here.
And if you would like to learn more and hear more of our conversation, we've posted the full interview I did with Walida. It's on our KGW YouTube channel.
So again, I want to recognize that the videos we're showing are very deep and bring up some emotions. For the segment of time, we are going to keep moving. Next slide. So as we talk more about perspectives, let's understand that individual racism includes a person beliefs and actions that perpetuate oppression. Those can be both conscious and unconscious, explicit and implicit, externalized and internalized. When those beliefs and actions directly impact how someone interacts with another, then it becomes interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism is still at the micro level because it is between humans, not between or among institutions or systems. Institutional racism occurs when institutions and systems of power. This refers to the unfair policies and discriminatory practice of institutions like schools, workplaces, hospitals, etc., that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when they reinforce racial inequities. Those individual institutional policies then accumulate and span across institutions to create structural racism. Structural racism is racial bias among institutions and across society. This involves the cumulative and compounding effects of so many societal factors, including history, culture, ideology, and interactions of institutions and policies that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. They all build off each other, self-perpetuating unless you intentionally interrupt it to make change. Next slide. Disparity is unequal treatment or outcomes for different groups in the same circumstances or at the same decision point. Disproportionality is the ratio between the percentage of persons in a particular racial or ethnic group at a particular decision point or experiencing an event compared to the percentage of that same racial or ethnic group in the overall population. Systemic racialization is like structural racism that was defined earlier, is dynamic, ever evolving, and deeply embedded in American culture. White supremacy is the air we breathe. It's not just the obvious, overt, violent acts of white people against people of color. It also includes microaggressions in the everyday America in which we live. It is so much part of our society that we don't even recognize it as such. White dominant culture norms such as competition, power hoarding, individualism, fear of conflict, defensiveness show up in the workplace, in the school system, in the child welfare system, in local, state, and federal government policies. It shows up in who's your boss, who's your children's teachers and principals and school administrators, who make decisions about child protective service cases in which communities' funding is allocated to improve social determinants of health, such as access to transportation, healthy food, healthcare, and more. We'll talk about intersectionality between and among the homeless response system and some of the other systems shortly. Next slide. I want to hand, as we go to the next slide, I want to hand the next part of the presentation to Michael as we talk about data. Next slide.
Thanks, Kenesha.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we've been through a lot of history and a lot of context. Now we can start talking about ways that we can address these issues. And data is a great way to start understanding the disparities that exist within your system. And we're going to talk about this very much in the framework of targeted universalism. That's a framework within which you can analyze your data to ensure racial equity is prioritized. Using a targeted universalism approach is simple, outcome-oriented. It rejects a blanket universal strategy and builds from a shared goal or a universal aspiration. The approach looks to meet the specific needs of each member of the community identifying the specific barriers to attaining the universal goal for each group within those. HMIS is a great set of data specific to your homeless services system, but there are other data sets that may supplement the data in HMIS. So we're thinking about things here like eviction and other housing related data, school data, hospital and EMT data, criminal justice data, and there are multiple other sources. I also want to mention here, and we're going to touch on this a little later too, but I want to mention that HMIS does have limitations, especially in rural areas and especially for tribal nations. HMIS is not a perfect tool, but it is one of the most powerful data collection systems that we have for homeless services. Specific issues that I was thinking of here are, data collection in rural areas is often a challenge, and that is certainly an issue for HMIS. I also want to acknowledge, as we saw in the video before, that many members of tribal nations do not identify with the demographic choices offered in HMIS. There are defined options for demographics there, and many people in tribal nations just don't identify with those. The result is that many members of the community you're trying to measure there get missed just based on the terminology. So I just wanted to point out some of those limitations. Another thing here is to look at who's involved in analyzing data. Are those persons that the data represents involved in analyzing or understanding the data? And then think about qualitative and quantitative information, because both of those matter and both are important. Next slide, please. In targeted universalism, this is the process. Establish a universal goal, assess performance relative to that goal, identify different performance between the goal and the overall population, assess and understand structures, and then develop and implement targeted strategies. Next slide, please. And this is where we're touching on that concept of HMIS not being perfect again. It's not, and it never will be. But you don't want to let perfection get in the way of progress. I think if you take anything home from this slide, please let that be it. Don't let perfection get in the way of progress. Use what you have, let it help you get better. Quantitative is the what of how your system is performing, so that's your numbers, and that must be balanced with qualitative, which is the why, understanding why your system is performing the way it is. Disparities may exist in both who is served or accessing our homeless response system, as well as how they are served. We aren't looking at the performance of people, but the performance of our system in serving people. So look at who is at the table when decisions are made and when data is interrogated. So who isn't included? Who needs to be included? Does the table need to be completely rebuilt? Which I know is something we have seen in communities. Don't just invite people who have no power. When people are invited to that table, they must be given power. They must be meaningfully engaged in the process. This will create a broader perspective and a broader understanding of the data. Next slide, please. So this slide, we're going to talk about coordinated entry. Those of you working with the continuum of care will be familiar with that. We could do an entire session or many of them on coordinated entry and equity. But the biggest point is to interrogate your system, not just by who is accessing coordinated entry, but also who is not accessing coordinated entry. Are there barriers or lack of support for specific groups in accessing coordinated entry? And also look at how your coordinated entry system is serving people. Disaggregate the data by race, ethnicity, gender, age, household type, disabling condition, as well as the intersectionality between and among various identities. So we're thinking Black, female-headed households with children, etc. Next slide, please. So these are just some data sets. We'd want to ask, are any of these data sets that you're already reviewing? Are there other data sets that you're looking at? What other data would be helpful to you? So we're really just putting this up here to provoke some thought about what data sets you have available and what other ones might need to be on the list. What data do you need to look at? What we have up here is things like child welfare, education, the criminal justice system, housing, economic wealth, health and environment, and adverse childhood experiences. But again, that's just a sampling. So this is really just to get you thinking about what data sets you have available and which ones could be useful. Next slide, please. So as we discuss further about intersectionality, thinking about homeownership. In 2019, a state task force reported that Black Oregonians had the lowest rates of home ownership, with 32.2% of households owning a home, compared to 65.1% of white households. When we think about income, racial disparities in household income remain high in Oregon. For example, the median income of both white and Asian households is $20,000 more per year than Native American or Black households. When we think about renter cost burden, households of color in Oregon spend a greater share of their income on rent and are more likely to be housing cost burden than white households. A 2020 survey of Oregon tenants examined renter needs during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. By the summer of 2020, 35% of those surveyed owed back rent, a rate that increased to 56% among people of color. Thinking about wealth. Data on wealth and assets by race are not available at the state level, but Oregon likely mirrors national trends. And across the US, racial disparities in wealth are even more stark than income. Black families' median wealth is less than 15% that of white families at $24,100. Hispanic families' median wealth is $36,100. Families from other racial and ethnic groups have lower wealth than white families, but higher wealth than Black and Hispanic families. In terms of unemployment, Black and Native American residents are affected by unemployment at the highest rates across all racial and ethnic groups, with rates of unemployment at 9% and 11.5% respectively, compared to 5.2% of white residents at the time that these were collected. Child welfare involvement. So children of color are overrepresented in foster care in Oregon. In 2019, children who identified as Black or African American were 5.7% of those in foster care, and those who identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native were 4.5%. Next slide, please. So according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness most recent State of Homelessness report, 14,655 people were experiencing homelessness on a given night in Oregon. So we just want to throw that number out there to frame homelessness a little in the state. Next slide, please. So many communities in Oregon that are home to larger groups of Black, American Indian, or Alaskan Native, and Hispanic or Latinx individuals and families are nested within a broader regional funding structure, making it more difficult to recognize and tailor services to their needs. This is true for the state's largest concentrations of Hispanic or Latinx people, as well as many of the state's largest groups of Black and Native American and Alaskan Native people living outside of reservations. When we did our analysis, the discovery team of Stella P data concluded the following. Across all 8 continua of care, there's a higher proportion of white, non-Hispanic head of households and adults accessing permanent supportive housing than those who access emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. Each COC has its own unique disparities that do not mirror characteristics of other COCs across Oregon. A further interrogation of quantitative data coupled with qualitative data and the insights of people with lived experience of homelessness will help each COC more accurately understand the human experience of individuals and families accessing their systems and create effective strategies to address disparities. Next slide, please. I think I might have had something in my run of show here where I think I went through the wrong thing on the last slide. Can we go back one slide, please? I apologize for that. That was my fault. Let me give you a little more information on this slide specific to it. Sorry, everyone. So the table displayed here shows racial and ethnic disparities among people experiencing homelessness by comparing the characteristics of total population, population experiencing poverty, and population experiencing homelessness. Homeless population and subpopulation data comes from the 2020 point in time count data reported in the annual homeless assessment report to Congress. Point-in-time counts serve as an unduplicated one-night estimate of sheltered and unsheltered homelessness, typically conducted annually at the end of January. Although the count methodologies are widely seen as an undercount of those experiencing homelessness, the use of the methodology across communities provides one statewide metric of homelessness. Because communities' ability to conduct point-in-time counts in 2021 were impeded by the pandemic, the extent of the pandemic's impact on homelessness in the state is still emerging. So we're still getting to a point where we can understand that as counts resume. Data on the total population and population under 100% of the poverty line come from the American Community Survey, the most recent 5-year data from that. These data show that in Oregon, people who identify as Black or African American are 2% of the total population, but 4% of those in poverty, and 6% of those experiencing homelessness. In other words, the percentage of Black people experiencing homelessness is 3 times their share of the total state population. People who are American Indian or Alaskan Native are overrepresented at an even greater rate of nearly 4 times their share of the general population. People who are American Indian or Alaskan Native are about 1% of the total population, 2% of those in poverty, and 5% of those surveyed by the point-in-time count. Overrepresentation is also seen among Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. So while those who identify as white or Asian are underrepresented, it's important to note that further disaggregating the data within a pan-ethnic racial identity group, so we're thinking Hispanic, Latino, Asian, and Asian American or multiracial, those terms that cover multiple ethnic groups, further disaggregation is needed to provide a full understanding of racial disparities for specific groups within a large group. So for example, it may be that while Asian or Asian Americans overall are underrepresented among those experiencing homelessness, subgroups may be overrepresented. So further analysis is needed there. Next slide, please. So thinking about child welfare, nationally, we have seen children of color are overrepresented in the child welfare system. A study found that while Black families on average tended to be assessed with the lower risk scores than white families, they were still 15% more likely to have substantiated cases of maltreatment, 20% more likely to have their cases open for services, and 77% more likely to have their children removed instead of being provided with family-based safety services. There's also an intersection here with poverty. So if you're a parent here today, think about the last time you were with your child in a situation where you felt like you were being observed or your interactions with your children were being watched. It could be when you took them to a medical appointment, when you dropped them off at school or daycare, or any other setting. So while those situations may be limited or momentary, families in poverty experience this much more often and with much more scrutiny tied to those observations. So exposure bias refers to the increased exposure that families affected by poverty experience with social services systems, including many avenues of state financial or housing assistance. Applying for these services requires a certain amount of scrutiny be put on a family, which can lead to becoming involved with the child welfare system for behaviors or actions that a family not interacting with these social services would not lead to child welfare system involvement. So just trying to get that assistance can lead to the child welfare system becoming involved. Disparities happen at every single point along the child welfare system process, and different forms of bias present along this process. So in terms of internalized, private beliefs that biases about race and racism that are influenced by culture. Then there's the interpersonal aspect. So private racial beliefs affect interactions with others. And then we think about the institutional aspect. That's unfair policies and discriminatory practices of institutions that routinely produce unequal outcomes for people of color. Structural aspect, that's cumulative effects of history, interactions, and policies that systemically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. And then once in the child welfare system, there is a higher rate of those children and youth later being involved with the criminal justice system and struggling with finding employment, in addition to higher rates of experiences with the homeless response system. So there is a lot of intersection there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to ask everyone to reflect on the first time you had a non-white teacher in school. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that. If everyone's had a moment, it is I thought about this one when we went through this, and I'm getting older, so it took me a while to remember. But I did remember. It was Mrs. Hightower in the 3rd grade. I was in the 3rd grade before I had a teacher that was not white. Today, roughly 80% of public school teachers are white, even though a majority of public school students are children of color. So why is that? Beginning in the 19th century, Native American children were forced into residential schools run by religious organizations to focus on assimilating them into American culture. So we're thinking culture, language, values, and behaviors. And this was done through deculturization. Where have all the Black and brown teachers gone? Well, there are a few reasons. So while the decision in Brown versus Board of Education declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, it also paved the way for an unintended consequence. So the effects of which we're still feeling today. It caused dismissal, demotion, and forced resignation of Black educators who staffed Black-only schools. After the decision, tens of thousands of Black teachers and principals lost their jobs as white superintendents began to integrate schools, but balked at putting Black educators in positions of power over white teachers and staff. Many factors contribute to the school achievement gap, including home and neighborhood environments and school factors unrelated to teachers' performance. There are also notable differences in the way Black students are treated by teachers and school administrators. Black students are more likely to be suspended or expelled, less likely to be placed in gifted programs, and subject to lower expectations from teachers. Disparities can arise from cultural misunderstandings or implicit biases that affect thoughts and behaviors. While Black students are 54% less likely to be recommended for gifted programs, after adjusting for factors such as standardized test scores, they were 3 times more likely to be referred if their teacher was Black. A study showed that when Black and white teachers evaluated the same Black student, white teachers were 12% less likely to predict that student will finish high school and 30% less likely to predict that student will graduate from college. Another study showed that when white teachers give feedback on a poorly written essay, they are more critical if they think the author was a white student than a Black one. Students who are suspended are more likely to drop out of school and have run-ins with the juvenile justice system. 2013 to 2014 data reveal that Black children represent 19% of preschool enrollment, but 47% of out-of-school preschool suspensions. Research has shown that 3 specific factors make a child more likely to be kicked out of preschool. And those factors are being Black, being male, and looking older. Teachers need more support from their administrators and among their peers to start addressing these disparities that exist within the system. Next slide, please. So we'll touch on the justice system here. Disadvantage accumulating at each step of the justice system process contributes to Black and Latinx people comprising 56% of the incarcerated population, yet only 30% of the US population. The roots of this disparity include conditions of socioeconomic inequality contributing to higher rates of some violent and property crimes among people of color. Many race-neutral policies have a disparate racial impact. These are policies such as broken windows and stop, question, and frisk, which have disproportionately impacted young men of color. Prosecutorial policies and sentencing laws that dictate harsher punishments for crimes for which Black and brown people are disproportionately arrested also feed into the disparities found within the criminal justice system. Criminal justice practitioners' use of discretion is often influenced by racial bias. Key segments of the justice system are underfunded, putting Black and brown people who are also disproportionately low income at an even greater disadvantage. Criminal justice policies exacerbate socioeconomic inequalities by imposing collateral consequences on those with criminal records and by diverting public spending. We learned about the history of mass incarceration. Excuse me, that's not right. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than anywhere in the world. Looking back to the ratification of the 13th Amendment, 8 months after the end of the Civil War in 1865, the convict leasing system would be established, allowing states to rent out Black prisoners to private companies, which forced them to work on plantations, railways, and mines without pay. Many of those subject to convict leasing were charged with petty crimes and vagrancy. What's emerged since is the prison industrial complex, a term used to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And this costs us about $182 billion annually. So how does this create an intersecting issue with homelessness? According to the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, a growing body of research comparing the cost of homelessness, including the cost of justice involvement, shows that housing is the most affordable option. We know that criminalization neither prevents nor ends homelessness, yet even recently, communities have passed legislation criminalizing homelessness. It continues to happen. After people experiencing homelessness are arrested, they return to the community, still experiencing homelessness. Criminal convictions create barriers to obtaining employment, some benefits, and housing. This is also not a good use of taxpayer resources or law enforcement time. So, excuse me one moment. I apologize, I'm catching up here. We can go ahead and jump to the next slide. Thank you. So we know that housing is a core solution, but not everyone has equitable access to housing opportunities in the first place. There's a well-documented history of mortgage market discrimination, which means that Blacks are significantly less likely to be homeowners than whites. Homes concentrated in majority Black neighborhoods are devalued by almost 23% compared to those with very few or no Black neighborhoods, which cannot be fully explained by home and neighborhood quality. Lower wages, along with historical discrimination that prevents them from owning homes and building wealth, means that people of color are more likely to rent and are also more likely to struggle affording that rent. When people struggle to afford rent, they face greater risks of instability, eviction, and homelessness, which links to an array of negative life outcomes such as food insecurity, poor health, lower academic achievement, and lower economic mobility, and it all builds upon itself. Gentrification is complex, but it's important to understand historic conditions, especially policies and practices that have made communities more susceptible to gentrification. The way that disinvestment and investment patterns are taking place today is a result of these historic conditions. Looking back to redlining that designated neighborhoods as desirable or hazardous, many of these same neighborhoods are now gentrifying. And how's that possible? Housing and transportation policies in the mid-20th century helped fuel predominantly white suburbs and the phenomenon of white flight. So throughout the New Deal, the Federal Housing Administration subsidized home builders that were mass producing subdivisions for white people only. And these homes were explicitly prohibited from being sold to minorities based on race or ethnicity, and that included Black, Brown, Jewish, and Greek people. Urban renewal really left behind certain city neighborhoods, low-income households, and specifically communities of color that became the epicenter of highway system expansion and urban renewal programs, resulting in the mass clearance of homes, and also businesses and neighborhood institutions. More recently, the foreclosure crisis, sparked by disproportionate levels of subprime lending targeted towards Blacks and Latinx communities, resulted in mass foreclosures. So now we're seeing an influx of people flooding back to historically disinvested neighborhoods to take advantage of relative affordability and older historic housing stock that have close proximity to city centers and revitalization. For many communities, this cycle has caused displacement. The physical isolation of people of color enabled policymakers to devalue and disinvest in these communities, denying equal access to quality housing, adequate school funding, good job opportunities, healthcare access, and nutritious food options. Segregation in housing is the way you can accomplish segregation in every aspect of life. And that's from Pulitzer Prize winner Nicole Hannah-Jones, that quote. Substandard housing quality is more likely to be experienced by people of color, which exacerbates racial health disparities. So in terms of modern day policies and practices, in Minneapolis, Black families earning more than $167,000 per year are less likely to be given a home loan than white families earning $42,000. Give me one moment. Evidence shows that real estate agents today sometimes steer prospective homebuyers into certain neighborhoods based on their race. And then there are a number of other factors like continued redlining, zoning, FHA, racially restrictive covenants, etc. And we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So poverty and lack of access to economic wealth and income are predictors of homelessness. The average living wage in America today is $16.54 per hour, which is more than twice the federal minimum wage. If folks don't have access to economic wealth, which is often handed down from generation to generation, they must rely on income. An important part of the story of rising income inequality is that experiences within America's racial and ethnic communities vary strikingly from one group to the other. As of July 2018, income inequality in the US was greatest among Asians. From 1970 to 2016, the gap in the standard of living between Asians near the top and bottom of the income ladder nearly doubled. Asians displaced Blacks as the most economically divided racial or ethnic group in the US over that time period. Asians overall rank as the highest earning racial and ethnic group in the US. However, the gains in income for lower income Asians trailed well behind the gains for their counterparts in other groups. People at the lower rungs of the income ladder may experience similar diminished economic opportunity and mobility and have less political influence. I think one of the things we really want to point out here as we talk through this is what you see when you look at specific subpopulations, though. So we talked earlier about pan-ethnic umbrellas. So, when we look at this poverty rate here, I believe this one was from 2016, all Asian American and Pacific Islanders showed a rate of 12.1%. But then when you look at groups that fall under that umbrella specifically, you see much higher rates of poverty in those groups. So it's really important to understand what that means for the data that we collect and why it's important to further disaggregate, like we talked about a little earlier. Next slide, please. So when the shutdown sent unemployment levels skyrocketing in 2020, Black and Latinx workers were much more likely to be among the jobless than white people. This was true even though people of color make up a disproportionate share of essential workers. Only 19.7% of Black and 16.2% of Latinx people work in jobs where they can telework, compared to 29.9% of white and 37% of Asian workers. Research shows that almost 70% of middle-class Black children are likely to fall out of the middle class as adults. 65% of the Black population in the US is concentrated in just 16 states that have unfavorable economic and social conditions. On average, these states score below national average in every leading state index category that includes 77 metrics of state performance. And those metrics are things like economic opportunity, employment, healthcare access, healthcare quality, public health access, and access to broadband. Some factors that contribute to the disparities in economic wealth and income. So community context. Each community is composed of the collection of public and private assets, and these assets overlap with the economic, social, cultural, and political networks and institutions that tend to reinforce existing socioeconomic patterns. And then there's family wealth, Wealth reflects the net value of a family's pool of financial and non-financial assets, and it takes time to build and is often passed on from one generation to the next. Family income represents how families come to earn the cash flows they receive from either entrepreneurship or their participation in the labor market. And income is often dependent upon employment, which is often dependent upon education, which is often dependent upon where you live, and you can see how these root causes not only intersect with the homeless response system, but also between and among each other. And then family savings. That represents how families interact with the rules that govern savings and wealth creation, as well as the tools and benefits that families can access to manage household expenses, smooth out consumption, and add to family wealth and community context. Next slide, please. In April 2018, the Samuel Dubois Cook Center on Social Equity published a white paper titled What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. This white paper talks through 10 common myths held about how the racial wealth gap will close, and the report indicates that closing the racial wealth gap requires an accurate assessment of the causes of disparity and imaginative action to produce system reform and lasting change. So at every level of educational attainment, the median wealth among Black families is substantially lower than white families. On average, a Black household with a college-educated head has less wealth than a white family whose head did not even obtain a high school diploma. Black folks with positive wealth do not tend to have a greater share of their asset portfolio in home ownership than whites. Nonetheless, white folks have considerably more resources than Black folks, greater home equity, and higher values in every other type of asset. Among households that own a home, white households have nearly $140,000 more in net worth than Black households. The existing infrastructure of Black-owned banks lacks the capacity to produce wide and substantial increases in Black wealth. The key to assisting Black businesses in their development and growth lies in leveling the terrain of racial wealth differences and increasing Black entree to startup and development capital in the first place. If anything, it appears that Black folks generally live in more frugal lives than white folks. That's another myth. Study shows that at comparable levels of income, white folks spend 1.3 times more than Black folks. Or I'm sorry, I phrase that as a myth. White folks spend 1.3 times more than Black folks based on the study. White folks generally have more resources to invest at the outset. Not only do they invest more in home ownership, they invest more in financial assets too, but they have more of every asset simply because they have more resources. There's no magical way to transform no wealth into great wealth simply by learning more about how to manage one's monetary resources. Not only does successful large-scale entrepreneurship have a disruptive effect on existing businesses, but it can also accentuate the wealth divide between rich and poor. Even those members of marginalized communities who manage to enter entrepreneurship are unsuccessful due to many factors, including undercapitalization, limited market access, or outright theft or destruction. The argument that intergroup disparities in wealth are born out of group-based cultural deficiencies is misleading and misdirected. Instead, we should focus on the long exposure of low-wealth racial groups to theft of wealth and blockades on wealth accumulation. Earnings and other types of income are derivative from opportunities created by the wealth position of one's parents and grandparents. So larger structural conditions, well-documented wage and unemployment gaps demonstrate that even when Black people do the right thing, it does not close the racial wealth gap. Despite recently released data showing that the median Black family has a net worth of about $17,600, while the median white family has a net worth closer to $170,000, Black life has come to be seen more through the lens of radically exceptional cases. So the veil of Black celebrity must be pulled back, enabling all Americans to understand that there is no racial meritocracy in wealth. And finally, the rise in single motherhood is possibly driven by different mechanisms for Black mothers and white mothers. Single motherhood reflects inequality, not a cause. White women still have considerably more wealth than Black women. Data show that economic benefits typically associated with marriage will not close the racial wealth gap, and marriage does little to equalize the wealth among white and Black women with a college degree. Next slide, please. So social determinants of health are powerful influences on our lives. They are conditions in the environments where we are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age, and they impact a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. Disparities exist in social determinants of health because they are such a driving force in our lives, and those disparities have far-reaching impacts. So just a few examples of the disparities. Black folks have mortality rates that are more than twice as high as other races, and Indigenous people have significantly higher mortality rates as well. People of color are more likely to suffer severe illness if they are infected with COVID-19. Black households have far less access to tax-advantaged forms of savings due in part to a long history of employment discrimination and other discriminatory practices. According to the CDC, Black mothers and children die at disproportionately higher rates than their white counterparts, regardless of their income levels. And research suggests that racism, which has produced segregated neighborhoods with fewer hospitals, higher rates of chronic illnesses, and unequal access to healthcare, is the main culprit. So one specific type of social determinants of health, or excuse me, one specific type of social determinants of health are adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs. Research shows that ACEs have a tremendous impact on future violence, victimization, perpetration, and lifelong health and opportunity. This is something to keep in mind as we're working with communities or working in the community addressing inequalities in their systems. ACEs include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, mental illness, incarcerated relatives, a child's mother being treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. Research has shown that ACEs disproportionately impact people of color, and because of the time of life when ACEs occur, they can have lifelong impacts and negatively impact the trajectory of one's life. Next slide, please. So, who holds power and how can this be more equitable, diverse, and inclusive? Include the voices of lived experience of homelessness. Keep the work centered on community goals and ensure that definitions for what the goals are shared. Set short-term goals, not just long-term goals. This allows for pivoting and updating as needed. Housing problem solving is not a separate project type within an organization or within HMIS. It's a philosophy that can be embedded in your entire homeless response system, just like housing first. This is flexible conversations with people to identify safer alternatives and creative pathways out of the crisis and potentially keeping them out of the homeless services system. And we'll say this again, data means both quantitative and qualitative. It also means looking at the performance of the system, not just who is accessing the system. Qualitative data includes talking with people, and that helps you understand how the process is working from their viewpoint. Change is hard, and it can be difficult to implement. So simplify the process wherever you can and incorporate community buy-in. Community buy-in is essential. The changes you adopt tomorrow won't be the end. Establish ongoing monitoring processes that allow you to pivot and revise as information changes or as initial outcomes aren't what you anticipated. And I have just said a lot of things. I'm going to turn it back over to Kanisha.
So just as we get ready to wrap up, just some harmful practices to eliminate today. I know we discussed a lot, talked about the history, talked about data, so some things you can do today. We can't just rely on numbers. Numbers will tell us the what, but not the why. So please talk with people. Utilize various tools to get that information. Texting, social media, focus groups, public meetings, town halls, the good old phones. We are not serving homelessness. We are serving people, whole entire people. Over the past several months, communities have partnered with public health, public housing authorities, hospitals, and other systems to best serve folks. This was a necessity born out of the pandemic, but it's a necessity even outside of a pandemic. We serve people better when we work with other systems and non-traditional partners to understand the people we see holistically. People with lived expertise provide a perspective that is unique and invaluable to the community. Incorporate them intentionally, meaningfully, and ensure they have power and the tools necessary to not only sit at the table, but to create the table. Just as we would not expect a surgeon to provide their expertise for free, we should not expect people with lived experience to provide their expertise for free. Next slide. And getting into that, who or what is defining who is deemed an expert? This presentation is not meant to be a token for communities. It's meant to be the beginning. All this we said today was just the beginning, a middle of an ongoing long-term process. Incorporating persons with lived experience into your planning and decision-making process is not performative or done for the purpose of checking a box. Do this intentionally. Hear to listen when they speak. Incorporate their feedback into your processes and shift. Ensure that you pay folks for their expertise, including people with lived experiences. Ask them what they need and want to be fully engaged participants. Next slide. So as we wrap up, action steps are important. What concrete things we can do to incorporate equity and show up in communities as well as within our own teams. So some of the things we talked about are not all comprehensive, but give some ideas of things that we can do, including understanding oneself, understanding and diversifying your team, adopting cultural humility when working with communities. We can't overlook or jump over the uncomfortableness and even scary parts of this work. Some of it's personal work, and to be effective and minimize harm, we have to do it. And another specific step you can take is to review documents like board member rosters, COC governance charters, committee structures, even your HMIS governance, and etc. Look at any information you have about historical redlining and segregation. Review your most recent racial disparity analysis or gap analysis. What documents do you have on things you have already done? Information about local tribes, information about Native corporations. Ask about the organization you work with and which of these work with minoritized population. Next slide. So we appreciate you for listening to all the information that we gave you today. We do have space for questions and answers, questions or feelings, not even questions, just how you feeling right now. During the history part, was some of that stuff anyone knew already, or was it some new information?
I wasn't aware of the detail. I knew overarching that Oregon had a pretty racist history, but I didn't know in detail. That was really good. Thank you.
I would say, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. And there was definitely some information in there I was aware of, but I appreciated how you incorporated kind of a cross-sector analysis. So not just looking at housing, but also other systems like the carceral system, child welfare, health, things like that. So I thought that was really helpful to see all the information together.
I thought this was just excellent, and I learned a lot. And you said, how do you feel? And I feel sad and just kind of overwhelmed. You think we're making progress, and then you see this information, and obviously the problems about racial justice and inequity are definitely systemic. They're just woven into our lives in so many ways. So, it is a bit overwhelming. So I think this was super beneficial to me. And so now I want the presentation on how in the world do we go about making some positive changes. Thank you. This was really good.
Paula, I think you're muted. Looks like you're saying something.
I thought I unmuted. Sorry about that. So most of you know that I'm with a community action agency, and I've been thinking about our board composition and so forth. And we are required to have 1/3 of our board composition be elected officials. And predominantly that kind of starts us off at a disadvantage. And no disrespect to Senator Anderson, but it would have been really nice to see what the racial demographics on elected officials are, and what is that history, and why more people of color don't run for office. Is it because of public office? Is it because of that superiority in income, gap wealth, and so forth? And so that's one thing I think we feel is missing. So again, for us, we come out in a disadvantage because in our community, we don't have a lot of people of color who are running for public office. And I wish we could see some growth in that, because that is really how change, and it would filter down, I feel, all the way to the local level. But it was a wonderful information, and I would love to have more conversation about the history of Oregon, especially with the Native American, especially the reservations and how they came about, and how our relationships with them are more organic than in pen and paper, and how we should honor those relationships, and so forth. So thank you.
Can I actually just answer Paula's question? Because it's actually an issue that the Urban League is it's one of our legislative priorities for the long session. So legislators at the state level make $33,000 a year. So as a person that was looking to potentially run for office myself and like utilize my skills, there's no way I could do that. Like, and I don't even have kids. So like, I can't imagine, having a family that I'm accountable for, trying to make that work. And most legislators of color who are in the legislature have a second job in addition to being a legislator. And so, at least for the Urban League, we view this as an equity issue. We view it as a barrier to access, and we view it, we see that there's an opportunity to shore up our democracy by diversifying our state legislature. And so we're working in partnership with both the ACLU of Portland and with Apano to put forth a legislative concept to address this very issue, to ensure that Oregon's legislature is reflective of the state's, and that everyone has an opportunity to serve if they choose to do so.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback, because I'm sure that resonates all the way down to the local level. So again, our board is local elected officials, and what does that usually add up to? That's usually county commissioners, and some of them are full-time, some of them are only part-time, and I'm sure Senator Anderson would agree, it takes money to even put your name out there and to get your views known. So I appreciate that.
And there's a larger conversation around good governance that speaks to that, about increasing salaries across the board, as well as campaign finance reform, and transparency and ethics in politics. So there's going to be some good work done, and hopefully we can, make some moves and, yeah, make things better.
Compensating the pure voice is near and dear to my heart. This is Jessica from AOC. Before I came to AOC, I spent the last 10 years working in mental health, raising money for mental health research, innovations, and a lot of that was making sure that the projects we funded were either peer-led or had meaningful participation by peers in any area, whether it's research, policy development, or program development and service delivery. So in the housing realm, I'm thinking at the state level, there's now a program and fund set aside to compensate people for bringing their lived expertise to the table. I don't think that those funds are available to local advisory and governing bodies, but I think it may be something that we should consider in the future.
If I could add one thing on that, we're not, for my organization, again, it has to do with policy at a much higher level than what we're at, but we are not allowed in the majority of our grants, if any, to pay for board participation. It's an unallowable cost. So in order for us to compensate board members, especially those who, you know, bring the purview of a marginalized community, we would have to come up with discretionary funds. And if you work for a nonprofit, it is always very difficult to come up with non-grant funds and discretionary funds. So that's another barrier. But again, that's a policy decision at a much higher level.
Yeah, Paula's correct, and it's something at OHCS that we are looking at right now and seeking guidance from DOJ on, because it is a priority for us. So it's something that we are working on, and it's something we have to figure out.
And well, if I could add one more thing, I'm hoping, because, you know, I know I represent, you know, the community action world, who has historically been, you know, homeless service providers. And I'm hoping through this process that we can learn from each other, and that some of the things that make our systems look the way they do have to do with policies that are outside of our control. And yes, we're still participating in those policies and so forth, but I'm hoping that we can bring real change to every level, so that regardless of who is providing, you know, the service, and whether it's one or if it's all or if it's many, that we all have the ability to respond to the needs of those who are unhoused, and really make meaningful impact on those folks. So this is what I'm hoping, is that, you know, these little things that come up about us not being able to pay board members, we can't pay for advocacy groups or anything like that. So that feeds into the system.
Any other additional thoughts, Marisa?
Yeah, I guess one last thought here, and I think it just sort of maybe it's a little bit piggybacking off of what Paula just said, is, you know, we do have to always come back to that systems analysis, and it is kind of an overwhelming task because, you know, I really appreciated the slide. I always like the visual slides in these types of trainings that break down like the individual versus the institutional and systemic. And I always feel like that is just so useful to always kind of come back to in these conversations. And so I'm really glad you brought that in. And I think that, you know, one of the phrases I hear a lot around this type of work is, you know, we can't tinker around the edges. You know, and it does kind of go into what you're talking about, Paula, is like there's so many small changes or incremental changes that we can make, but that doesn't quite get at the ways that systems are fundamentally based in, you know, mechanisms of inequality. And so what do we do with that question? This isn't like a prescriptive statement. It's just simply saying like, I think that requires a different level of analysis and like an approach that is open to some really, you know, uncomfortable conversations and possibilities. And yeah, I just think that it really requires that we sort of step outside of our comfort zones, because as the presentation really emphasized, this is many, 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 many years in the making. And so, yeah, I just want to kind of voice that. I'm sure plenty of us are already thinking about that.
Any final thoughts? I'm recognizing that we are 5 minutes over. So I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and note that we will have a lot of opportunity to really process and digest and have dialogue because we are going to be meeting in person, COVID permitting, on September the 9th. So we're nailing down some details, but we have identified a location and I'll be sending that information out. But thank you to each of you. I know that was a lot of information to digest. Overwhelming is absolutely right. It's overwhelming for me to hear, and I usually do these at least a couple times a month. So thank you for your time and attention, and have a good evening over there on the West Coast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Bye,
Stay
everyone.
cool, folks. Bye.